Hey everyone, this is Libertarian Black Man. I'm going to talk about the reparations issue in this video because a few weeks ago I was featured on the Supreme Penny Stocks YouTube channel and was asked questions about what my opinion was on African American descendants of slaves and whether or not they should be given reparations for slavery. This is an issue that has come up in the 2020 presidential campaign, which inspired the host of Supreme Penny Stocks, Lascelles Enugu, to bring me on the program and talk about the issue. So you can find the video if you go to the Supreme Penny Stocks YouTube channel and find the video titled "Can America Afford Reparations?" which was posted on April 2nd, I believe, and watch my interview. And I do give insight on how I felt at the time. Since then, I've done more research and more thinking about the issue, and I want to give you my current opinion on the reparations issue. I want to compare two situations, the one of the Asian internment, which I'll just define what that is, and one of African slavery, which I will also define in the upcoming slides. But I want to define what reparations are first. So if you look at the definitions provided by Merriam-Webster, it is the act of making amends, offering expiation, or giving satisfaction for a wrong or injury. The definition of dictionary.com says that reparations are compensation in money, material, labor, etc., payable by a defeated country to another country or to an individual for loss suffered during or as a result of war. OxfordDictionaries.com says reparations are the action of making amends for a wrong one has done by providing payment or other assistance to those who have been wronged. So the common theme is that when someone is unjustly harmed, the one doing the harming will pay for the harm in some fashion as a repair of that situation, which is why we call it reparations. It's about repairing a wrong. Now, there are two key differences between the cases for reparations for Asian Americans and African Americans. One difference is how to compensate, and the other is who to compensate. I will define what those mean in a second. So in the case of Asian internment, we go back to the 1940s where Japan attacks America at Pearl Harbor. In 1941, America jumps into World War II. Anti-Japanese sentiment grows nationally. President Roosevelt responded to the national attitude with an executive order in 1942 throwing Japanese Americans into prison camps without being given a chance to contest that. The government searched the homes and confiscated the property of Japanese Americans without proof of any illegal activity or wrongdoing by them, all under the pretense of national security because America had just jumped into the Second World War. Japanese Americans are being viewed with suspicion because the nation of Japan attacked America. Most Japanese Americans lived in West Coast states, and over 120,000 of them were forced against their will into camps located in Montana, North Dakota, and New Mexico during World War II. Now, this was totally unjust. It never should have happened. It's not constitutional. It's not moral. It's not legal. But we did it because that's just the way the country generally felt at the time. Amends were made 40 years later. Ronald Reagan signs a bill called the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, in which authorized reparations to be paid to each of those Japanese internees at the rate of $20,000, with payments beginning in 1990. Now, if all 120 of those internees were compensated at that rate, the price tag would be $2.4 billion. Only about 8,000 Japanese Americans, which is about 2/3 of those who were interred, claimed and received reparations, costing the federal government $1.6 billion. To put that in perspective, the federal budget in 1990, when payments began, was $1.2 trillion. So the reparations to the Japanese constituted about 1/10 to 2/10% of the federal budget. In the case of African slavery, you have a totally different situation in terms of how long it went on and how much economic wealth was lost as a result. The first laborers were brought from Africa to the American colonies 400 years ago in 1619. This is the 400th anniversary of the beginning of African forced labor in America. And at the time, from 1619 to the 1640s, it was not officially slavery, it was indentured servitude. But then it becomes slavery. So demand for the cheapest labor to supply the needs of a growing population, because we have more settlers coming to the United States, to the American colonies from Europe, leads to a larger population and more demand for food and so on. And so we are seeking the cheapest labor. And there was another thing that happened. It was the case of John Punch, which led to the transformation of indentured servitude into institutionalized slavery. The difference between indentured servitude and slavery is that indentured servants work for a period of years and then they're set free. A slave is born a slave and they live as a slave and they die as a slave. With the case of John Punch, he was not a slave. He was an indentured servant. He ran away from his master in 1640 as an indentured servant. And when he was caught that same year, he was sentenced. He was prosecuted and he was found guilty and sentenced to be a slave for life. That was his punishment for running away from his master as an indentured servant. This was the beginning of slavery. And from that point on, Massachusetts, a few months after the conviction of John Punch, becomes the first colony to legalize slavery. All the other 13 colonies followed all the way into the 18th century, and slavery begins as an institution and continues for another couple hundred years. In 1860, we had about 4 million slaves in America according to the census. Slavery was ended with the 13th Amendment of our Constitution abolishing it in 1865. Now, I have reparations for slavery with a question mark at the end because the case to do reparations for the descendants of slaves is not as clear as to do it for Japanese Americans. Even though African American, the institution of slavery did far more economic harm than what was done to the Japanese, the way to compensate is not as clear. Because if each slave from 1860 produced a single descendant, and they were compensated at the rate the Japanese were at $20,000 each, it would cost the federal government $78 billion, which is not a big price tag because the federal government is spending trillions of dollars a year right now. However, if each slave produced 2 descendants to be compensated at the rate of the Japanese reparations, the price tag would rise to $156 billion. 4 descendants each, and you're talking $312 billion at $20,000 per descendant. If you were to compensate each one of the estimated 45 million currently living African American descendants of slaves, you're talking about a price tag of $900 billion. But if you were to raise the compensation rate up from $20,000 to $100,000 per descendant and compensate the estimated 45 million of them, the price tag would be $4.5 trillion, which is an amount larger than our current federal budget. The question is, how do you calculate the economic impact of slavery, which ended 154 years ago, on currently living descendants? Keep in mind, there is no person alive today who was a slave. This is not the case with Japanese Americans because those who were compensated in 1980, starting in the 1990s, actually were put in those prison camps. We cannot compensate slaves who were wrong because they're not alive today. We can only compensate the descendants. And by the way, those descendants we're talking down to the 4th and 5th and 6th generation. So we actually can't make the wrong right in the same way for African Americans as we did for Japanese Americans. And if the value of lost wages comes out to $100,000, you're talking per descendant, you're talking about reparations that are trillions of dollars. Which means, how do you get the money? Do you raise taxes? Do you borrow money? Do you print money? how do you pay reparations, not just for slavery, but also for Jim Crow laws, because there's an argument being made that we should compensate African Americans not just for slavery and the economic impact of it, but the economic impact of Jim Crow laws that introduced racial discrimination after the Civil War ended. So this issue gets more complicated when we're talking about reparations for African Americans, and as a result, estimations for the amount of reparations are all over the place. We have economists saying that if you look at the value of wages lost from 1620 to 1840, $1.4 trillion would have to be paid. And this is in 1983 dollars, meaning that the amount would rise to over $6.5 trillion in today's money for reparations. Another estimate at the time said $2.1 trillion had to be paid. Again, 1983, if you look at that same estimate in today's money, you're talking over $10 trillion today. Another estimate said that Jim Crow laws from 1929 to 1969 cost black Americans $1.6 trillion. This is not even counting slavery. This is just Jim Crow. And by the way, Jim Crow from 1929 to 1969, which is a period of time that does not even encompass all of the time Jim Crow's laws were on the books, hurting the economic opportunity of African Americans. You've got other estimates put out by other news organizations showing that there are different numbers. We're talking, one economist says that from 1790 to 1860, $2.1 to $4.7 trillion of labor was stolen from African Americans, and that's in 1983 dollars and should be paid as reparations. Well, in 2019 dollars, it's not 2.1 to 4.7 trillion. It's more like 8.8 to 12.3 trillion or something around that ballpark in today's dollars of reparations that would have to be paid. Another estimate, if you add slavery, Jim Crow, and other discrimination laws that took place from the 1860s, actually from the 1620s to the 1960s, you're talking $6 to $24 trillion that would have to be paid as reparations if you add it all together. Another estimation says slavery reparations could be $14 trillion without counting Jim Crow or other discrimination laws. The Black Agenda Report, a website, has made a calculation saying $1.5 million should be paid to each slave descendant in America. And by the way, there were 40 million of them according to their calculation back in 2000. Well, that was about 20 years ago. If you look at 2019, there's probably about 45 million slave descendants. So if you were to just take that number of 40 million, which is a low number, and from 20 years ago, and pay each of them $1.5 million, that means you're paying out $60 trillion of reparations at that rate. To put that in perspective, the national debt, if you look at public and private, not just government, but also non-government debt, $100 trillion. If you look at the size of our economy, $20 trillion. If you look at how much the federal government spends per year, $4 trillion. So the total debt is 5 times bigger than our economy, and our economy is 5 times bigger than the amount the federal government even spends per year. So the dilemma is, how do you pay for reparations for African Americans? Well, the government can do a number of things. It can create money by printing it and minting it out of thin air. This would destroy the value of the money if you're going to do this by the trillions, because we already have a dollar that has lost over 90% of its value over the last century, and that is without having to print trillions more. Money is of no value if it buys nothing, and if you debase it enough by printing and minting too much of it, it will go to zero. You could also, the government can raise money by raising taxes and selling bonds, treasuries, but this would hurt the economy because higher taxes hurt economic growth, taking capital out of the hands of business and individuals, and all the bad things that go with that. Selling treasuries means going into debt. The best way to generate the money to pay reparations is to acquire savings through cutting government spending and generating more economic growth by lowering taxes and reducing market regulations. You would create more income, which would pay down the national debt and generate a national surplus where you could pay reparations without higher taxes or debasing the currency. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe to the YouTube channel, and we hope to see you in the next video.